Okay, welcome to my recording. So this is being done just because partly you can hear my voice is slightly struggling, but also so you can sort of go through the activities in this in your own time. So this is picking up on this sort of learning outcome one, which is know the structure and function of the skeletal system. But we're moving on to know the structure and the function of the muscular system. So without further ado, let's go to it. So you'll see here, if I can sort of draw around here, the area we're working to is really the next assignment, which is coming out soon, and it covers all of that. So particularly we're working towards this sort of section here, identifying muscles of the body, describing the function of the muscular system. So let's press on. There we are. So at any point, if you want to slow down, just pause it and sort of look at it in your own time. But I want to sort of gun through it fairly quickly. So last time we looked at the classifications of joints. So what I was really trying to emphasize was this thing here, that we initially try and look at three classifications of joint, and we consider those to be fibrous, so the sort of fixed joints of the skull, the pelvis, maybe even the ones between the sternum, the cartilaginous joints, so ones that might be considered partly movable. So we looked at things like the intervertebral discs. It could be a cartilaginous joint. Also the joints between the sternum and the ribs, those sort of sternocostal joints, would be considered cartilaginous. And then we looked in greater depth at synovial joints. So if you looked at the synovial joint on the left, so it's, you can see up here, it's a little finger. So it's kind of cut in that sort of frontal plane, and it sort of opens up. The most important thing to do, you've had a go at drawing your own synovial joints, is to make the cartilage here nice and blue, to show it's sort of blue and shiny and slippery. The fluid, you kind of will have had a go at drawing fluid, so I'm just dotting it in a little bit there. So this is a nice sort of oily, thin fluid which keeps it all lubricated, and it's created by this bit here, which is the synovial membrane. So the synovial membrane is reinforced by the fibrous membrane over the top, and then the ligaments around the outside in some joints help support that joint. Some joints like the knee have ligaments inside. So the important thing is that all synovial joints have that same sort of structure, but we have those 6 different shapes. We looked a little bit more in the knee, this slightly more complex shape. You can see those sort of ligaments in the middle, the cruciate ligaments. If I just sort of dot them here, so you commonly hear about these being torn. They prevent that sort of forwards and backwards movement of the tibia on the femur. They also sort of prevent a little bit of rotation as well. So any position where the knee is held in kind of extension and rotation, or even flexion, and then they rotate, puts those ligaments at a bit of vulnerability. We've got these collateral ligaments at the side. I'm just outlining them now. Where's the other collateral? Here we are, down the bottom. So these ligaments prevent that kind of side to side motion, called valgus and varus. So if you like, the knee has got sort of these support mechanisms of the cruciate ligaments preventing forward and backwards, the collateral ligaments preventing that sort of side to side movement. And we've also, if I just colour it in a nice sort of yellowy colour here, we've got these meniscus. You can't pick that up that well, but you can just see me doing that a little bit, which is sort of C-shaped kind of cups of cartilage, which allow, if you look at the shape of these, what are called femoral condyles, I'll put a nice big sort of cross over them. These femoral condyles, there we are, there we go. Look at that shape. You know, that's not that sort of needs a very specialist cup to absorb it, if you like, to sort of for it to be able to glide into. So they improve that sort of joint congruence. So I just want you to know, have a go at writing about the knee. So just spend 5 minutes, just tell me what are the articulating bones, what movements are allowed and not allowed, and what are the special features of the joint. So you should pause this presentation now, and then we'll pick up when you rejoin. So good luck. So I hope you had a crack at that. What we'll see is if we can add, we can see you've had a go at writing. So I would start with just the basics. So the knee is a synovial hinge joint that provides an articulation between the femur and the tibia. It only allows flexion and extension, with other movements being restrained by the strong collateral and cruciate ligaments. The fibrocartilage menisci allow the condyles of the femur to fit closely into them, and they increase that joint stability. But we've also got that patella at the front. So the patella is in the front of the joint, and the underside fits into that groove you see between those two condyles that I mentioned earlier, allowing the quadricep to extend the knee. So we talked about, I mentioned this concept of flexion. So you can see a few examples of flexion here. If we start from the top, that sort of motion of tucking your chin into your chest is narrowing that angle just underneath your chin. So that's a kind of flexion. The alternative is you look up at the sky. We consider that to be extension. So if you look at the third picture along, that's really easily identified at the elbow. Do you see how we're narrowing this angle here? So as that arm comes up, narrow the angle at the elbow, and that's flexion. Here at the wrist, we narrow that angle in the upturned wrist, and that's flexion. Here at the hip, that's flexing at the hip. Even though the knee is staying extended, the hip is flexing. And then here we've got knee flexion. That's a good arrow, isn't it? There we go. Knee flexion there. And on the opposite side, what has to happen there? Extension. So most of that's happening in what's called the sagittal plane. You can see that picture above my head. Sort of has that sort of plate of glass where all movements are moving along that sagittal plane. The only one that's not is this kind of lateral flexion. So you can see the chap on the bottom right hand corner. He's sort of leaning to his right side, and that's narrowing that angle on his right side. So we call that lateral flexion. So have a think about how flexion is used in these sporting movements. So what you can see, just get up. If we're looking at knee flexion, so here we've got a person Thai boxing. Can you see they flex their knee, but they've also flexed their hip. So we've got two examples of the knee and hip flexion being used. The first one I've written here actually is knee flexion, hamstring the two muscles running when you pick up your heel when the leg swings through during gait or running. So imagine your heel has just hit the floor, you're now rolling through, and the other side you have to pick up your heel to kind of keep your momentum and pick it up off the floor. So the hamstrings have to work in that knee flexion. The Thai boxer, you can see that hip flexion there happening through the action of psoas, which is a hip flexor, TFL, tensor fasciae lata, and rectus femoris. So we've got an example of hip flexion in Thai boxing. And then in shoulder flexion, you sort of need to look at these two pictures actually to see it happening. You see the lady at the back, her arms are sort of just about down. You can imagine she's just about to jump into the water. So her arms will sort of come down to her waist. And actually that's as it goes past the waist, that's actually called extension. It's a slightly confusing term sometimes. But as the arms come up So as they come forward in front of the body, that's shoulder flexion. So to get from picture number 2 to number 1, she's had to flex her shoulders. So what I'd like you to do, you've got access to this video. I might be able to get it working on here. That'd be difficult. So I've emailed this video separately, and what I want you to do, I want you to look at the slow motion, just literally the first 20 seconds. You might want to keep the video running, just to sort of get clear in your head what's happening. But what I want you to do is describe the shoulder and hip movement as the sprinter explodes out of the block in the first 20 seconds of that clip. So he starts with the left foot slightly forward, which is going to be mean a slight hip flexion. A slight hip flexion and a slight knee flexion to get there. I want you to tell me which shoulder moves in to extension, i.e. moves backwards first, and I want you to tell me how the hips and shoulders move over the first few strides. So you're going to need to take the hard copy of this presentation, or if you just quickly go to YouTube and type this in. So I'll let you do that and then return in a few seconds, okay? Okay, we can do it. Here we go. You can see the chap here throwing his right arm back as that right hip flexes up. Here, look at that left hip driving up, big flexion, accompanied by that left shoulder moving into extension. Let's concentrate on that left leg driving into extension, and it's the left shoulder is driving into flexion. So really powerful movements there. So I think what's important to see is that sort of cross body motion, and to be able to describe how important that shoulder extension is in driving that power. I think this is Usain on the right, but you can see that sort of cross body movement as they power out of the blocks. So what I'm okay, I hope that's worked. We sort of seem to be back in. So yes, so these are the terms you should know. You should know the terms flexion and extension, particularly with respect to the hip and the knee, and also considering the shoulder. So in that previous video, you should have seen that the right shoulder moves into a rapid and powerful extension as it flies back. But that's matched by a powerful hip flexion of the left hip. Sorry, that should be extension actually, and right hip and flexion of the right hip, being sort of caused by the psoas, TFL, and rectus femoris. So just to return, this should read extension. There we are, of the left hip. So opposites. So as the left shoulder goes, right shoulder goes back, the left hip flexes. So you've got this to colour in. So your job, firstly, is to pause this presentation and colour in each of those. So all you're doing is contracted, relaxed, and stretched. So pause, and welcome back. Now you've done your colouring in. So what we see here is the bicep, that kind of classic bicep curl action requires the bicep brachii A to contract. Now, if you've ever had a cramp, you'll realise that muscles that are contracting at the same time don't allow movement. So to allow that movement to happen, the tricep, which is the C in this that first picture on the left hand side, has to be able to relax and lengthen. Now, where you can see elbow extended on the right hand side, now that tricep is actually active to allow that active extension, and the bicep C is now stretched. What's not quite clear in this picture is, if you imagine on the left hand side, let's imagine you're holding a weight, so a small dumbbell of just 30 or 40 kilos. and you're lowering it. Now that bicep doesn't relax, does it, to get to extension? It has to contract to control that lowering. So we call that contraction an eccentric contraction. So your muscle is having to lengthen whilst also contracted. Whereas on the way up, if we perform a repetition of that weight, so we're pulling it up, that bicep is contracting in what we call a concentric contraction. So the muscle is shortening to create that movement. So the two key terms are that we have concentric and eccentric contractions. One shortens to create movement and one lengthens under tension. And we also have this concept of muscles working as either agonists, they're the main moving muscle, or what we call an antagonist. So in this case, the tricep is having to relax to allow that bicep to flex the elbow. When that movement is reversed and we're performing an active extension involving the triceps, then the triceps becomes the agonist muscle and the bicep becomes the antagonist. So that agonist stroke antagonist is covered here. You've got this version to colour in, so I suggest you pause and colour it in yourself now. It should be relatively self-evident. Here's my, let's say, prime mover here. So you'll colour inside each of the little words. So here we've got prime mover. Let's go a little bit bigger for me. Might be too big. Oh no, works perfectly. There we go. So what you can see is in A, that's my prime mover. So in elbow flexion, the prime mover is the bicep, and I'm just colouring in the antagonist there. Now, what's added to this picture is this concept of muscles acting as a fixator. So if you go and grab a very heavy dumbbell, you'll notice that actually you feel your shoulders tighten if it's a particularly heavy dumbbell. And what they have to do, look to start with, look at the origin of that bicep. Let me get it in red here. Do you see how that attaches on to the scapula in there? So if that bicep is going to pull with any force, that scapula has to be controlled. And here it's done by this big sort of hooded muscle over the top called trapezius. Attaches to the thoracic and cervical spine, right up into the neck, base of the head, but also onto the scapula. So when that bicep contracts to pull, the scapula has to be stabilized by that trapezius muscle. So the trapezius muscle contracts in what's called an isometric contraction. So iso meaning same, metric meaning length. In the same way you get isotonic drinks, they're the same balance as your body fluids. So think about times when you're pushing. So if you imagine something like a squat, for example, you might be pushing powerfully with your quadriceps and your glutes, but actually the lateral hip muscles, things like glute medius, may be contracting isometrically to act as fixators. So fixators stabilize joints to allow other muscles to perform their work. Got a chap doing a concentration curl here. The colour's not come out great, but you can see just his bicep is very isolated here. So that sort of exercise, you don't really need so much of the fixator. So that's why bodybuilders like to use this exercise to sort of really isolate a muscle. It means they don't have to waste energy on fixating muscles. It's very much about an isolated contraction. So your job now, I thought this was going to come up better. So what I was hoping to do, look down here. So which muscles are the antagonists? So if we look here, elbow flexion using the biceps, like the chap over the page. So we should be able to note his triceps are the antagonist in that movement. Elbow flexion requires the triceps to relax. If we use hip flexor, our hip flexors, which are our psoas, a little bit of a muscle called tensor fascia lata, then our gluteus maximus has to relax. In knee flexion, using the hamstrings, the quadriceps have to relax to allow that movement to happen. In the last one, where we see shoulder extension going back, we use the lats and the back of our deltoid, this posterior deltoid. So to allow that to happen, try it yourself. The pecs have to be able to relax and the front of the deltoid needs to relax. So maybe if you think about your own training, certainly when we consider sort of balanced programs, if people spend their whole lives just working their chest, as many people do, and ignoring the back muscles, you're kind of restricting your ability of your shoulders to perform that really powerful extension, and you may be losing a bit of that potential acceleration and power in your running. So this fine figure of the mat, I've asked you to describe the muscles involved when kicking a ball. So here's just an example you could use. So let's just talk through this, looking at what you see. So how would you describe the muscles involved when kicking this ball? So in the first picture, well, the first case, he's got to get that leg back, hasn't he? So we talk here about the right leg is drawn back to hip extension by the gluteus maximus. The knee is flexed using the hamstring, so you can see how his sort of knee, his right knee is sort of poised to deliver this kick. I've talked about the stance leg, so this is the left leg, is stabilised, so the quadriceps there are sort of active. You might have that sort of lateral hip muscle, gluteus medius as well, just a little bit active, and possibly even glute max, to just sort of stabilise that joint. So to initiate the hip flexors, to initiate the kick, the hip flexors sort of in here start contracting. So they'll contract concentrically, and then this knee joint, oh, that's not a very good picture, this knee joint is going to need to extend. So these quadriceps are going to be the muscles that are going to do the job. But to allow that to happen, the hamstrings on the opposite side will need to relax. In the same way the glutes on the opposite side of those hip flexors are going to need to relax. So he's got quite a strange style, certainly with his shoulders, but what might be an interesting task for you to do now is to watch someone kicking a ball and describe how the shoulders now are involved in this same motion. So find a video or a picture of someone kicking a ball, it might be a famous footballer or could be a rugby player sort of doing a conversion, and I just want to explain how the shoulders for them are involved when they're kicking the ball. So you can describe the shoulder motion and then also relate it to what's happening at that lower limb. So I'm going to pause the video and I want you to have a little crack at that, and then we'll sort of review what you've written. So your task here is to now print off these and colour them in. So this could be a job you do at home later. But really what I'm looking for you to do, you're gonna sort of answer some questions on this in a while as well. So here, if I just run through it very quickly, you've got a muscle called semimembranosus. These are your hamstrings. So if you find semimembranosus, I'll show you how quick it can be done. Here's your semimembranosus. There we go, underneath there, A. So do you see how it's running all the way down? And it connects onto the tibia. So that's your connection down at the tibia. Now, if we take a different colour for its brother, semitendinosus, we can see semitendinosus is B. So semitendinosus is here. And he also attaches onto the tibia. So we can see when we look at hamstrings, the two on the inside, the medial muscles, are semimembranosus, semitendinosus. So if you then take this big one here, starts at C, there. So what you can see is that they all have this common origin. So we call that the origin of a muscle. And here, can you look at the name? Ischial tuberosity. Now, what's interesting about the other ones is that bicep femoris, that third hamstring, see where it attaches? So it attaches just on top of the fibula down here. Just put a little line next to that. But it also has an attachment that goes from the femur onto the tibia. So it's got two heads. So we call that bicep, as in bicep brachii. So here we have bicep femoris. It's got two heads. So it means that our body has a slightly harder time coordinating its movement. So when we tear hamstrings, and you see people often sort of feeling them right in the back of their ischial tuberosity, it's usually that muscle because it's much harder for the body to control. Here we've got the quadriceps. So quadriceps up here. I'm just going to draw your attention very quickly. The picture's not quite so great on this one. If we look at this one here, rectus femoris, over the top, attaches to the pelvis and attaches to the patella. So that big muscle over the top is also the quadricep that you're most likely to tear if you tear a quadricep muscle. Again, you can see it crosses the knee down here and also crosses the hip. So how is that different to your other quadriceps? Well, if you look here, we've got this muscle, vastus lateralis, begins on, I'm just colouring it in here, begins on the femur and inserts into this patella. If you look at vastus intermedialis, begins on the femur, attaches into that patella. And if you look at that, vastus medialis, begins on the femur, attaches onto the patella. So we have four muscles, but we refer to this sort of vasti group together, and they're sort of a bit less likely to be injured because they all attach onto the femur and then straight onto the patella to allow that hip extension, knee extension. And then lastly we go on to the gastrocnemius, so your favourite muscle from PE at school. And again, similar style. So let's just put this in place. So we have, I'm only going to look at two muscles here. One is this one here, soleus. So soleus, if we look here, you might, you'll need to print this off to sort of really make it make sense. I'm losing it a little bit myself actually. It looks like L is our soleus. Yeah, soleus is pretty sure it's L. So yeah, it must be L because the gastrocnemius is M. So here, do you see this muscle here? I'm just colouring it in blue. So it's going to attach, it's quite deep. There's a few other deeper muscles that sort of control the angle of the foot. It inserts into the Achilles tendon, so it's going to insert sort of down here really. But it's going to join this bigger muscle that's over the top, which is the gastrocnemius. So the gastrocnemius is those two big sort of bellied muscles at the top of your, calf, and they actually begin up here on top of the back of the femur. So again, if you consider they attach on the back of the femur and they insert into this Achilles tendon that I'm just colouring in green here. So again, a big powerful muscle, but one that crosses two joints. So those two muscles, soleus and gastrocnemius, are involved in something called plantar flexion. So that's where you point your toes to the floor. The key difference is that the gastrocnemius, because it crosses two joints, one, it's probably a little bit more powerful, but also much more liable to injure. Your job now is to answer these 10 questions. So when you've done that, take them to your tutor and show your answers. And then there's a final task that I'm going to get you to perform as homework. So here we are. Here's your homework. So you're going to read and research. This has gone up back to front. So what I want you to do is this. I want you to read page 10 and 12 of your course book. That's number one. So this is the one that you've been emailed. It's the Stafford Brown book. Number two, I want you to tell me what those following movements are: plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, hip abduction, and hip adduction. Number three, you're going to list the muscles, or you're going to find the muscles involved in each of those movements. Number four, you're going to explain the muscles that attach near the knee joint and what they do. So this is a slightly extended answer. And then number five, you're going to do this one. You explain how the right hip, knee and ankle joints are involved in the initial acceleration when sprinting. You might need to sort of go through the motions yourself a little bit in this, but try and review what you did earlier when you saw the slow motion sprinter and we concentrated on the right hip and the right shoulder. Now you want to put the knee in, and you're also putting the ankle in. So you're describing how the gastrocnemius might provide that plantar flexion to that initial spring, how the quadriceps might create hip extension to really drive that knee into extension, and how that is done at the same time as the same side glutes and the hamstrings powering the athlete into hip extension, all the while the opposite shoulder coming through into a powerful flexion. So those things should take up about a page of paper. So make sure you bring those to your next session, along with on the next slide. There's nothing. You've finished. Well done, you. So the point of this all is that you're trying to get comfortable with covering all of these terms. So we were looking at major muscles of the body. So when you've done the activities, you should be confident describing triceps, deltoids. We looked a little bit of pec major, but not that much. We didn't really talk about the rectus abdominis, but we did look at rectus femoris. We did look at vastus lateralis. We did look at vastus medialis.